Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CEDH. I'm your host, Lyndon, aka Noobzors, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Morgan, aka Spleenface.
How's it going, everyone?
And that's it for the crew for this episode. Another, just, two-person podcast. Hope you, hope you guys don't mind. But in this episode, we're going to be covering deck impressions. And impressions, of course, social media impressions. It's all about the how many impressions you can get on your Moxfield page, in any individual deck. Shares, likes, views, all that. No, I'm just kidding. It's about how we perceive decks threat level wise. More or less, and we'll get more into that as we break it down the main topic. So normally, in the show notes we've got before that what you've been up to since last episode, but this episode is actually kind of a short order since the last episode that Morgan and Reed recorded. So I imagine, Morgan, not much.
Not a whole lot, yeah. Well, not a whole lot. Let's
I guess, dude, Vintage Cube is over, right?
Yeah, we did cover that on the last one. But,
oh, nice. What was your final trophy count?
It was 20.
Nice. Oh, nice. Very solid. Cool. Well, without further ado, let's jump into housekeeping, of which there are none.
Share it. It's been a little while for you.
I quickly became as soon as Vintage Cube launched, I was like, nice, Vintage Cube, let's get back into it. I think quickly got 4 trophies and was like, that first day or two was 1 trophy shy of being on the front page of like the trophy leaderboard. And I had a couple 2-1s in a row, and then it's like, fuck this shit, I'm done with Vintage Cube. I'll just watch other people draft and backseat, and that'll be my Vintage Cube.
You did backseat. I would never deny.
It's great. That's Vintage Cube is best played with other people, in my opinion. It's the social aspect of it.
People just in a tornado of shrieking goblins.
Dude, the one time we were on the Frog server playing a game, and there was an entire cohort of people just drafting Vintage Cube in the background, and everyone in the game except me had everyone else muted. So it was just like all the voices in my head are like pack one pick, like forcing storm, and in the middle of a game, it literally felt like I was going crazy. But I love it. I can't get enough of it. Do you know when it's coming back?
I don't.
I feel like they run it a lot now, though, right?
I think it's
it used to be Holiday Cube.
2,
now it's just like
3 times a year now.
Yeah. See, dude, that must be like the only reason a lot of people go to Moto, frankly. But yeah, cool. No housekeeping, no new patrons since last week's recording, and new developments, nothing really, because there's also a short gap. So that just means more time for the main topic. The way we've this is interesting because it's kind of a bit of a conceptual episode. Like, how do people threat assess decks? What is kind of the objective metrics that constitute what makes a deck threatening and powerful? So we had an interesting discussion pre-show, kind of working out the language and kind of structure that we want to use for this. So I'll let you kind of kick things off with our deck power metrics and kind of explaining things, and I can jump in.
So the first thing I'll say is that we're talking about decks, and we're talking about our impressions of those, which includes a measure of threat assessment, but we're not talking about threat assessment more broadly, which is often very strongly influenced by the actual game state or position in a game. So the metrics we have for the power of a deck are speed, which is fairly self-explanatory.
Like Goldfish, yeah.
Yeah, just how fast can it win? Consistency, resiliency, inevitability, disruptivity, and opacity. And by opacity, we mean sort of how obvious it is when the deck is in a threatening position, and how easy it is to know what steps you need to take to stop it from being a threat or winning.
As well as knowledge of what route or route whatever they would take to go for a win. So because Morgan made a great example in our pre-show discussion of blue farm having 7 cards in hand. They're obviously in a very threatening position, and the knowledge of cards in the list and what the things do in blue farm is known. People know that, but in that position, it's because the deck runs so many different win cons, it's hard to determine what they're going to do. So, how will you respond? What kind of interaction do you need to hold up, or what kind of stack pieces do you need to deploy? It's just not obvious if you have multiple options, but you can only choose one. So that's another factor in opacity. So opacity is one of the more complicated kind of metrics we have here. And just to clarify on each of these metrics a bit, disruptivity is a deck's ability to disrupt win conditions and win attempts from opponents. Then inevitability is, in the late game, which deck at the table has the best, chances of winning, just taking over the game. This tends to be decks with very, very strong engines. So, just a couple examples: Yorion, Azami, Thrasios decks. Things that scale really, really well. T&K Blue Farm is pretty. It has a very strong value engine in the command zone, but their engine really doesn't scale necessarily. So it's got higher inevitability as kind of like a floor than a lot of other decks in CDH. But compared to like a Thrasios deck with Training Ground, Seedborn Muse, all that stuff, those are going to be higher inevitability. Resiliency is how resilient it is to stack-based interaction and stacks, and you can really break down resiliency into kind of further subcategories, but we're kind of encompassing it all in one. And then consistency, I mentioned for speed, kind of the goldfish, what's its average goldfish, but the goldfish is, a function of speed and consistency. Speed is, in theory, what's the fastest goldfish, right? And how they do kind of mix a bit, but
I mean, a lot of these metrics will have like either they'll overlap or there will be like certain things that you could classify as one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And like that, like obviously a deck that can be interacted with extremely easily and sort of shut down, having low resiliency, it's going to be hard for that deck to be inevitable, because like if it's so easy to shut down, then how's it ever going to take over a game or whatever? But
Exactly, yeah.
Consistency is just, it's sort of a composite of how quickly
How
is it
redundant
winning,
it is,
how
yeah.
often is it having like sort of whatever you expect from it. Is that is it pulling that out consistently? Does it often have protection? Does it have things like that?
A good example of a highly consistent deck is like Yisan, right? Where it's doing and consistency could, it's not necessarily linear, although Yisan can be quite linear. But you've got a high redundant amount of things that are going to get you your turn to Yisan, and then from there it is just find exactly whatever you want, and then the random aspects are going to be what you're drawing for turn. So yeah, like that's kind of summarizes consistency. So yeah, deck power is going to be, and I was kind of talking to Morgan about like, what is the name of that graph? They have in like Pokemon with all the different like, things going up with all the different pentagons and stuff like that. And Morgan's like, oh yeah, that's a radar graph, a radar chart. So that's kind of what you can envision, where certain decks are going to have massive spikes in different metrics, whereas like the better decks in the format are going to be kind of more well-rounded, and have pretty high aspects in most categories, and that makes it a powerful deck. So why if we can kind of quantify all of these things for deck power, we can identify all these metrics. Why bother even talking about this in the terms of threat assessment? Well, it's because people aren't always accurate at gauging these metrics. Morgan, you want to talk
Yeah,
some more about that?
sure. So I think there's two main ways that people get this sort of wrong. The first is that with some decks, if we go back to the radar chart, their belief about what the radar chart looks like and what the radar chart actually looks like, there's just some mismatch there. They think the deck is faster than it is. They think it, has a ton of disruptivity, but it actually doesn't, or whatever. And there's a bunch of reasons that can happen, and we'll talk about those later. The other is that essentially what you do is you make something of a composite of all of these metrics, and that composite is going to be weighted based on a bunch of factors, and that can definitely lead to sort of a mismatch in terms of how threatening a deck actually is versus how threatening you think it is, even if your evaluation on each metric is actually relatively accurate. So I think we'll sort of do we want to start with that, or
Yeah. So like we've got the discrepancies between the actual the kind of true value and what you perceive it to be, and then the difficulty or kind of not adjusting your game plan accordingly or appropriately to the perceived threat level. So yeah, there's two really ways that this can go wrong, even if you're good at assessing it, you're assessing it correctly, or you're assessing it incorrectly. We're going to talk about reasons why you're doing that, but then also how you can maybe take advantage of that, and use that as an edge for deck selection into tournaments, or maybe if you're at least just aware of it, you can kind of cover up for your own shortcomings in that sense. So yeah, let's get into the reasons for the discrepancy in just the perceived threat level, and we have a fun little list here.
yeah. So I think the first one, and this one is huge, is the immediacy. So when threat assessing a deck, you sit down, your opponents reveal their commanders. The first thing you're looking for is, are there any super fast decks here? Because obviously you need that information initially to inform your mulligans, which is often the most player agency you're actually afforded in the early game. So when you sit down and you see, say, a Cody across the table from you, that immediately colors your impression. But that also, I think, people are not necessarily good at sort of adjusting over time to, okay, yes, I need an answer to make sure I don't die to Cody on like turn 2 or turn 3. But then, how does that change? And that's the same thing if you see, for example, like Rogsai. They're trying to kill you on turn 2 or turn 3 just as much as Cody is, sometimes even turn 1. But the way people adjust to those two decks as time passes, may not necessarily be appropriate. And as their threat level starts to wane, people remember that they're very fast decks and they can win really quickly, and continue to threat assess them very highly, even if they're actually quite resource limited and not necessarily in a good position to win.
Yeah, they often occupy a lot of your thoughts, a big portion of your considerations on your mulligans and your actions and things, what mana to leave up in the early game, and people don't shrink that portion of your mind that it takes up, and think about it. And it's always in the back of your mind. Maybe even if your threat assessment for other things might be right, it is just kind of that it's scary, right? It's scary and it's in your head, and that can kind of weigh on you and your decisions. So, I think that's part of the reason why I think I'm not super high on Rogsai, or and I don't think I'd take Cody to a tournament now that it's kind of more known. I think that discrepancy is in an assessment and adjustment really negatively impacts the win rates or how strong those decks can be.
Yeah,
You think
for
so?
sure.
Yeah.
I think that this is certainly like extremely true of Cody. I think it's a little bit less true of Rogsai, and I think that a lot of that has to do with the opacity of Rogsai,
Yeah.
in that you don't know exactly, like, you know that they're going to try and do something to you on turn 2 or turn 3, but you don't know exactly what that is, and so
You
you
don't know
don't know
what, though.
exactly
Yeah.
the easiest way to shut it down or whatever. Whereas with Cody, it's like, hey, just don't let them activate Cody. Like, that's a very simple.
Yeah.
Or
I know
if you're
exactly what
letting
they're
them
going to
activate
try and
Cody,
do.
make
Yeah.
sure the table has like 4 pieces of interaction. Um, and so that like really colors the way people tend to play.
Yeah, also the fact that like Cody is pretty, it's very high in consistency, pretty high in resiliency, means that people are, even more scared of Cody. And so if everyone's being responsible and you're being responsible, like you're devoting a lot of energy to Cody, and the opacity is low. So as soon as like it's everyone's eyes are, it's like the meme with like all the knives at the cat, it's like that's the Cody player. But yeah, Rogsai can get away with a bit more because of that opacity, and it is interesting that lowering those kind of metrics might actually be advantageous and result in higher win rates. Yeah. So next reason we have on for discrepancy in perceived threat level is clout, and clout is is just a short form for kind of a longer discussion point, which is people people shill decks. People, we're all EDH players. We all have pet decks. We all put a lot of time and energy into the decks that we like and enjoy and care about, and we like to share it. So if that's coming from someone who happens to have a lot of clout, then that means more people are going to hear it. So if you're hearing all about this Rogsai deck because lots of people with big Twitter follower counts are talking about it, and well-respected members in the community are talking about it. It's like, well, maybe I should give Rogsai a lot more respect, and maybe you might be giving it a bit too much respect in that sense. And that obviously true for a bunch of other decks as well.
Luckily, though, you're listening to the Into the North podcast, where we only accurately assess things. So as long as you listen to us, that won't be an issue.
So I've proclaimed myself the least successful clout farmer in CDH based off of the views I have on my Mox field for all my stupid brews. Dude, it is tragic. It is tragic. But honestly, I think that serves me well because, if I was out there shilling Riel all the time and, being like, hey, everyone, look at this deck and here's exactly how it works and blah, 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 then probably do less well. Fewer well for our friends. Dude, I can't believe they got me with that now. I every time less fewer, it actually messes me up so much. Thanks, Zach and Keegan.
The next thing to right this ship a little bit. The next thing we have is tournament results. Every time a list does well at a tournament, it immediately skyrockets up people's threat assessment. It immediately, like, the impressions of the deck get I think distorted a little bit. CDH is a very high variance format, and something doing well once is not necessarily indicative of much, and something failing to reach like the very pinnacle also doesn't necessarily mean much. Like, as often as people memed on Blue Farm best deck, never won a tournament, yada yada. Like, it was putting up a lot of top 16s and top 4s and clearly performing, and clearly a very strong deck. And Tazri with Zerda in the companion zone has a 60% tournament win rate, or 75% if you don't include draws. But that doesn't mean that it's a good deck, and I highly do not recommend anyone plays it.
Yeah, I think one thing CDH players have I'll call it a complex of competitiveness and kind of wanting to be seen as legitimate. I think like, and maybe not just the players themselves, but like the format kind of as a whole, where, for a long time, we were kind of not marginalized, but like we're a small niche community of the EDH community, which is a casual format, right? And then you see like all these 60 card players with like modern legacy. These are the people who are going to GPs. There's tournaments. There's moto leagues where the high stakes, people treating it very seriously. So we look at tournament results in those formats. They have larger just larger data sets to pull from, larger sample sizes. So the tournament results, that you see on MTG Goldfish are actually a lot more meaningful. Also, because it's 1v1, there's a lot less like confounding factors and just in terms of like multiplayer politics and all of this stuff. So, it's so easy to want to be like, oh, okay, well, Delver does so great in Legacy. We can look at the tournament results for Delver, and then try and like do the same thing in CDH, but it just doesn't translate that well, right? Our tournaments, we have much fewer tournaments, smaller, repeat, like a lot of repeat players in these tournaments. So yeah, it's take tournament results with a grain of salt, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There is still some useful information and insights to be derived from those results.
Yeah, it is. I think it definitely does put it into perspective, though, when you realize that, something like a GP is typically 15 rounds of best of 3, and then 2 rounds of best of 5, and then a round of best of 7 to win.
Yeah.
Which is, quick maths, 62 games, theoretically. Or, like, matches totaling 62 games. Obviously, you don't play all of them, because if you're 2-0 or whatever. But, and a CDH tournament is, like, I think the highest we've seen is, like, 10 games to win. And it sort of puts it all into a bit of perspective of how much less statistically significant a tournament result is in this format.
Yeah. I mean, tournaments are on the rise. We're seeing so many more events this year, and like new tournament orgs, and so like people also treating the format more seriously. Dude, it's crazy to see like pro players in CDH tournaments are talking about CDH. Still blows my mind. But it's really, really cool. So, people are treating it more seriously. So hopefully we get bigger sample sizes, larger data set, and kind of just more quality data in general. But yeah, for now, just treat it with a grain of salt. So next, we have community discourse. So this is kind of an extension of, these kind of, we got 4 points that are kind
Twitter,
of grouped together. Yeah. Like community discourse, clout, very similar, but it's not necessarily just clout based, but the people with a lot of clout tend to be the ones driving the discourse. But yeah, just if people have been talking about a particular deck or strategy in whatever sphere that you're in, be that Twitter, podcasts, YouTube, Discord, like it's just going to be fresh in your mind. So, you're probably going to be thinking about it more like, oh, I should be scared of this deck, a lot more than some other deck that I barely know or it's not talked about. That's not good. Don't do that. But unfortunately, we are humans and we're fallible and we succumb to just all of these things without being aware of it necessarily.
Yep. Next up we have, our own echo chambers or sub communities, which is just, while there can be certain beliefs or patterns in the broader community at large, often, whichever deck does really well in your meta or that people in your local group talk about a lot, that is absolutely going to color your impression. And it can often be hard to separate, like, is it just that's the deck that the best player in your meta is playing? Like, I know some very strong players who put up extremely impressive results in their local metas, 40%, 50% win rates, whatever. um is that because their decks are crazy strong? I mean, they're not necessarily weak decks, but um if you were in that meta and you saw that, it would be very easy to convince yourself, hey, this deck clearly must be extremely strong, when in reality, it's either some idiosyncrasy of your meta. Sometimes it's just the only player in your meta who isn't, budget constrained. I've experienced that in a few different places. Um, or just the most skilled player um, can create a lot of perceptions.
Really is interesting, just the kind of discrepancies between communities, like even like just Discord, right? Because Discord itself has a bunch of smaller communities, but Discord is separate from Twitter, is separate from Facebook. CDH exists and Reddit exists in all of these different places, and all of these social media sites kind of form their own ideas about the format. But yeah, in the small kind of even Discord and sometimes like servers that are highly linked, they form their own metas, and people you can't play with 100 different players regularly, or maybe most people just don't want to. And you tend to kind of get a siloing of particular archetypes, and different, metas settle in different kind of local, like stable points, right? Like, so we talked about like the turbo metas before, turbo Nas, like blue farm metas, and then our meta, which tends to be more control-y and long game focused. And then there's I play in Frog server, which is very blue. It's just very, very interesting that these how varying the conclusions you can arrive at in terms of like what is the best deck and what is the best strategy to be doing, just from your own experience. So it's really speaks to, you want to talk to other people, play in different metas, go get out of your comfort zone to just get more information and kind of broaden your broaden your horizons, man. Yeah. Last point we have is personal experience, which I feel like is kind of summarized by what I was just saying, right? And what you were saying, just your own
Well,
experience in your own meta.
so this is, I would say, more, or like, looking at a sub community is still, I would say, more data driven. Like, you see this person in your meta who puts up a very impressive win rate, and so you're, or something like that. By personal experience, I would say more like, just, I played against that deck and it just absolutely thrashed us 3 games in a row.
Yeah, sure.
And so the next time you see it, you're on high alert. Um, and like, that's often one that people, it's easy to acknowledge is not like a good basis for an impression, but is still really hard to shake if you've had the experience of just getting absolutely clowned on. uh,
Yeah. No, it is funny. I mean, you tend to see this a lot with when you play decks that have very, very polarizing matchups. Like when I play Thrasios Toggle Rocks, like that deck just clowns on certain decks, like just completely. Right, like you're like, oh, you're playing a very commander reliant deck, and your commander has 2 toughness. Get fucked. Like, and then they come back and they're like, okay, Rock's player needs to die immediately, even though that might not be necessarily the best evaluation of things based on the pod composition and whatnot. Yeah, no, that can definitely weigh heavily. Yeah, I think that kind of summarizes our reasons for discrepancy. And our last category we want to kind of talk about is cognitive biases. So, I mean, the reason for discrepancy kind of some of these could be kind of summarized in terms of cognitive biases, but we kind of just wanted to, talk about them using the actual language of the cognitive biases and talk about the different scenarios. Some of them aren't covered by what we just talked about. So first up, we have recency bias, and we have two types or two ways that it applies to this kind of threat assessment or threat perception.
I would say the first one is most obviously illustrated by the tournament results point. Like, we've said as a joke, whatever one, when you win a CEDH tournament, like, you get to be your deck is the only CEDH deck for the next week. And like, there's certainly some truth to, we've seen a pattern of many, pretty unknown decks or not super well regarded decks that won tournaments, and then people's assessments of them skyrocketed, and it was like red alert all the time. I think, not to pick on anyone in particular, I think Magda was probably like the clearest illustration of this. And people, it won a tournament based on some stellar play, absolutely. And then people sort of went like, oh, this deck is fantastic, it's the new hotness. And then people went, oh, this deck, when you were playing it, people were threat assessing it super highly because it must be great because it just won this tournament. And I think, it didn't take too long for people to sort of realize, okay, maybe this deck is, still a fine deck. It still has its strengths, but not necessarily, the second coming of S tier decks that some people might have believed.
Yeah, no, and it is Magda I really like as an example, just to illustrate how much you live and die by threat assessment and how you're perceived by your opponents, right? I think Magda basically had a pretty strong, like, it wasn't necessarily built to be super fast, but it can be. But it is very consistent, quite resilient, to a lot of people were holding up interaction thinking that it would stop Magda, when Magda's like, no, I can play through this easy. Very high inevitability. It's got the disruptivity as well in terms of tutoring stack speeds at instant speed. And because no one knew what the fuck Magda did and how it won, it had very high opacity. So like it had decent power. And people were just incorrectly assessing it too low. And, Magda was able to take advantage of it, or Koibito was able to take advantage of that by taking Magda and taking down a tournament. But then immediately following that, not even just people assessing it correctly, but, the overcorrection just makes the deck almost unplayable, right? Like, you don't see people jamming Magda into a bunch of tournaments because it's like, a lot of my edge was that that discrepancy in the how they're assessing it versus what it really was. So yeah, I think it is interesting that a lot of times we focus on just the pure power level of decks. We can get lost in the weeds of just, well, this deck is more consistent, this deck is faster, blah blah blah, and the individual metrics. When really what you might want to be looking at is what are the actual power level metrics, and what are other people's perceived evaluations of those metrics for what to take to tournaments. Yeah, and then the other type of recency bias is the player who is most recently the threat, or the player who is most recently doing something in the game, right? Someone casts a demonic tutor, right? Or they cast a maybe, sometimes with like an ad nause, if someone if someone goes all in on their combo turn, they do a bunch of stuff and then they get stopped. Usually people are pretty good at being like, that player's not a threat anymore. But, if they're doing something that is scary, you're like, okay, wow, they just cast a demonic tutor, that's pretty scary. Meanwhile, you're overlooking the person who's got all of this insane advantage and really should be evaluated to be the threat based on what they've done before, what they have on board, what they have in hand, and kind of how things are going. So yeah, don't get too caught up in what just immediately happened every time. Try and take a holistic approach uh, to your threat assessment.
Or like I've certainly seen people. I mean, this an example of this that maybe does more, is less about game position threat assessment is at tier 1 con, Reed won his semifinal on turn 2 with everyone watching because there was one piece of interaction and he had the protection. And then I went into my semifinal with the same deck, and the entire pod played a blue land and passed on turn 1.
Yeah, yeah.
Which I think was probably overzealous, right? There's a middle ground that is not don't keep interaction for Cody, but also isn't everyone hard mult interaction for Cody. But when you see the table before you just get clowned on, you go, all right, well that's not happening to me.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing, I guess this is kind of more in game as well. Is and this so I don't know, have we talked about APT on the podcast before?
I think it's come up once or twice.
It must have, yeah. But yeah, so we'd kind of we'd come up with in our play group this concept of actions per turn in the context of casual, where in casual games you want to minimize your actions per turn because people get annoyed if you're taking too many actions in a turn cycle or on a given turn. So like, that includes shuffling. So, Tatiova in casual is a great example of a deck that's tremendously annoying because you're casting a rampant growth, you're searching library for land, shuffling, ETB, draw. Then you're casting cultivate, and you keep chaining all of these cards, and you're casting a fetch land, or you're playing a fetch land, and you're playing something off the top. Like it just all adds up to so many actions and shuffles, and you're kind of dominating the game time or the clock, the collective clock, whatever. And that I think translates also to CDH, where people tend to assess the player who's taking the most actions or doing the most stuff kind of in the general sense to be one of the more threatening players. And, it's often because that tends to be true, right? Someone's doing, Lotus Petal, Mana Crypt, Dark Ritual, Demonic Tutor, Ad Nauseum, Breed, like, they're just going off. They're going ham. Yeah, that player is obviously very, very threatening. But sometimes they can just be spinning their wheels, right? There could be a Notion Thief. This was a lot during Hull Breacher meta. Was you just Thrasios activations just for like the scry and finding lands, in our meta sometimes, and it's like, man, is that player's like activating Thrasios 5 times or 10 times in a turn cycle, but they're not really doing anything, right? Don't get confused.
And I think this does also play into like on a less threat assessment and more deck perception level, people tend to view like combos and play patterns that involve a lot of actions as more threatening. Like if you think about, you're looking at an opponent who has 3 mana in play. Let's say they had like some sort of acceleration, either like a ritual into a 2-mana rock or a dork or something on turn 1. They're going to be untapping, they're going to play a land, and that's going to set them to 3 mana. Like, Dark Ritual Ad Nauseum, or Mana Crypt Ad Nauseum, or, whatever, is a threat you have to worry about from many of these decks. Similarly, Thassa's Oracle plus Demonic Consultation, or Neoform plus Demonic Consultation, or, some set like this is also something you have to worry about. But for some reason, people tend to view the decks that, might try and play, like I'm counting that as sort of a soft combo, right? If someone has 3 mana, they need some combo that gets them to 5, and then the Ad Nauseam is the payoff for getting to 5. Versus some way of assembling something like an Oracle Consult, or playing like Druid and Swift Wreck or whatever. people have a tendency to view the ad nauseum as much more threatening than, or like something they need to be really careful of compared to, the possibility of just getting sort of randomly consulted off like a tutor plus having one of the pieces or something like that. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna say like
and I think,
stacks decks, like a green base stacks deck slamming Eidolon of Rhetoric and Sylvan Safekeeper is, depending on your deck, if you really struggle under a rule of law, that is maybe one of the most threatening things someone could ever do. Like there's like two outs to that, right? It's like Psych Rift and Dress Down, or if you're on Deluge or something. Like there's not many ways to out that if you're required to out that to win the game, and people will let that slide, right? Like it's the frog in a boiling pot, like it boils slowly. If you play the Sylvan Safekeeper and then later you're playing the Eidolon, it doesn't set off the alarm bells that it would if you're casting a bunch of spells into your ad nauseum or whatever.
yeah, and everyone remembers, like the Nas turn or the Peta turn or whatever, where the person just like flipped all these cards and cast all these spells and made a bunch of mana and assembled some combo. And so, decks that can do that are regarded as being very dangerous when, often decks with like a lot of tutors, a more toolboxy orientation, but still a lot of tutors and relatively simple to assemble combos, are threat assessed much lower.
Yeah, it is. It's also just the fact that like a lot of these stacks decks win the game several turns before they actually close, right?
Yeah.
And if it's less memorable to be like, well, we actually lost the game 3 turns ago when he resolved this protection in the stacks piece, or this like the third version of the stacks piece that makes it impossible to do this, or the Sanctum Prelate to shut off the out of Psych Rift. Like that's when you actually lost the game, but you still have 25 life or whatever. So that is often just less memorable. But yeah, no, I always think it's a fun exercise to figure out when you're truly dead, right? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that does make you a better player to kind of just track that. I like against Yorion, man. It's like when am I dead? When can I concede? Because that deck does not close fast. Yeah.
Next up, we have confirmation bias, which doesn't necessarily create false perceptions or inaccurate perceptions, but reinforces them. And so this is, if you think that, say, Rogsai is a really scary deck, when you see them nause you on turn 2, you go, see, I knew it. Rogsai is a very scary deck. And you carry that forward into the next game. But when, they just can't find that right hand and they mulligan to 4 and they don't really do anything, and they're like casting Silas to recur Lotus Petal and like maybe block, you don't go, oh, Rogsai, has consistency problems or, maybe resiliency problems or whatever. It doesn't color your impression of the deck in the same way, and so you tend to prioritize or put more weight on experiences that affirm the things that you already believe.
Yeah, that also kind of ties into our next one, which is priming bias, right? Where you're more likely to be influenced by the first kind of impression or idea or kind of conception of something. So like, someone says Rogsai is the fastest deck in the format, like you heard that, like you're more likely to believe that and kind of roll with that and not like update with as more information comes out, or like, well, actually the goldfish of this deck is actually faster or whatever. It's like, no, okay, like this was already in my head, I'm just gonna kind of roll with that.
Or even if you like believe it, there's still a sense in which like there's a sense in which even if consciously you accept the facts, you still have a perception of like, oh, when I think super fast decks, I think whatever a person told me was whatever I thought was the fastest deck first,
Mm-hmm.
like that's what I think of as like the standard for fast decks. Um, and that is obviously influenced a lot by, perceived authority and community discourse. Um, and so, it's very important to be
Clout
cognizant
bias,
of
man.
that.
Clout bias. Um, yeah, and then our last one of these cognitive biases is the status quo bias. So I find in a lot of games, whoops, you might be basically dead on board, and this is going to tie into we're going to loop back around to the actual individual metrics themselves and kind of identify which ones are like key areas that you can kind of take advantage of. Where I think we were kind of discussing, we think there's like a community weakness and or like a I'd say weakness in accurately assessing things there. So like status quo bias is going to tie into this because people, once the board is kind of established, they're so reluctant to see things change. Like, if one player is in a very if things stay the same, they're going to win the game. Um, what might be important is to have another player come in and actually be threatening, so that you're forcing the other player to have to contend with that other threat, right? And then you're kind of shifting the power, making it harder, like loosening their grip on the game. But you tend to see someone's like, well, you're doing something scary, countered. Like I want to keep the status quo as is, and that can be so punishing. Yeah. Anything you want to say on that, or?
No, I think that's a good explanation. So I guess like where we sort of want to go with this is like, how do we
take advantage of this?
Yeah. How do we take advantage of this, and how do we make sure we're not like in terms of other people's perceptions of our decks, and how do we how do we make sure we're not falling prey to it? So I guess let's start with how do we take advantage of it.
Yeah.
I think there's like a few key things. First, I think one of the biggest factors is the first thing we said in that reason for discrepancy is that people hugely value speed. And we've actually talked about this like a long time ago in, decks that are trying to combo second. I think there's a lot of value in being perceived as the second fastest deck at the table.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Yeah, no, it just, and the thing is, it is all about the perception too, not about the truth necessarily, right? Because the speed is it's an average, right? And each player's hands are going to vary, and so let's say someone mulligans deep for like some really aggressive hand with like mana crypt and stuff, fast mana. That could change depending on their seat position, how they're going to mulligan. Like you do need to kind of factor all of these things in, and also if there's two decks, one is viewed as slightly faster than the other, that's going to people are going to be more concerned about that. But if it's really like only like point, if it's decimals of a turn in terms of gold fishing, like that really shouldn't matter all that much in your goldfish in your threat assessment, but it really does. So one thing, deck selection, take a deck that's not viewed as the fastest deck in the format. That way you're not going to always find yourself in that position. Also start politicking, man. Politicking and talk, because if you can identify like or just correct other people's threat assessment as well as your own, like kind of walk through why you think this person should actually be a threat, or you're viewing me as too much of a threat, or whatever, right? Maybe even if it's the other, you're not a threat at all, but you want to make sure that everyone else isn't falling prey to this trap and giving the game to the second fastest deck of the table. Just talk it through. And maybe sometimes people are gonna, give a counter argument and it's gonna correct your own threat assessment. So that's why, I'm a very talkative player in CDH, and I think our entire play group is that way, honestly. Um, but I find that it's like really, really helpful in tournaments. What about you?
Yeah, I think um, certainly talking is great, and I think one of the things that people I think underestimate the value of is obviously there's like what gets talked about is the like diabolically clever political maneuvers that you made to like totally shift threat assessment away from yourself and onto other people, and they all just ignored you while you accrued value or whatever it is. But also like sometimes just uh updating people's perceptions to like match, like if you think other people are suffering from biases, just like pointing out the truth can be a very powerful tool. And as you say, maybe you're wrong. Like I've
Mm-hmm.
certainly had that experience sometimes where like I get stuck in a rut. I think this deck is really scary, and I have like generally good reasons for that. And I'll be like, hey, what gives? Why are we letting this person get a pass? And then like someone will point out, it's like, yeah, well, they mulligan to 5 and they did this or that, and clearly it seems like if they had something going on, they probably would have gone for it already. Um, and so yeah, voicing opinions like that. First of all, it can let you correct other people's biases, and it can give other people a chance to correct yours. And I think that's very, very powerful.
Yeah. Another one of the metrics we have highlighted is inevitability, and I think so. That I tend to favor decks with high inevitability just because it's my preferred playstyle. I like to be in a position where, so long as I can ensure we don't lose in the early game, I'm basically guaranteed to win in the late game because I mean, just given the composition of the deck and how things scale, that's going to be the case. But also because I think people are terrible at accurately assessing when to deal with the inevitable deck, because you need the let's say it's a control player, right? You need that player on your team to help answer the very fast decks in the beginning. It's not like someone's going to Nas. You can't. There can't be like only mid-range player or something, or the other turbo player being like, man, I have to play table police. That doesn't make any sense. No, like you need the control player's help. And often you keep getting back to this control player. You're like, hey, can you help me with this? Blah blah blah. You're everyone's friend that's stopping people from winning the game, and then they blink, and then you've won because you've been accruing and you've been setting up these insane kind of engines. So really knowing when to hit the decks that have very high inevitability or that snowball, people are terrible at assessing that and knowing when to interact, and you can really really take advantage of that. Problem is that a lot of decks with really high inevitability do not mesh well with the current structure of tournament CDH and round timers. Normal CDH is played until people get bored and leave and concede, or they have other places to be. I've played some insanely long games of CDH. I think my record was like 7 hours, and that was like insane. You don't want too many of those games, but I do enjoy those every now and then. I really think it's a fun puzzle when there's multiple decks that have high inevitability in the pod, because you start assessing your threat assessment diverges significantly from everyone else's, where like someone is casting something pretty scary like I mean, I've even let Naz's resolve but countered like a fast flicker in Yorion, because it's like, well, I think I can handle the Nas, or I think we as a table can handle the Nas. If Yorion gets their engine going, I am screwed. My only real opponent in this pod is the other late game deck. I think that's such rewarding and fun gameplay. And yeah, it is also just an area that I think the community is generally kind of weak at assessing.
So play Dirtle decks. That's the
Yes.
Linden approved advice.
I mean, you also play a lot of inevitable decks as well.
I, in certain ways, yes. Um, I tend not to take them to tournaments as much.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
but I tend to play my decks more inevitably, which I think is somewhat to my detriment because they get assessed as if I'm not playing them conservatively when I
Mm,
am.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, there is some truth to. Certainly, I play decks that tend not to mind going to the late game, with the obvious exception being I took Cody to a tournament. But
Yeah.
but setting that aside, yeah, I think some of these are this isn't necessarily like a super helpful uh answer when it comes to things like tournament results and discourse. Um, I mean, just sort of don't pick the decks that everyone's talking about. Like, and you
Yeah.
know, if that's your deck, and you've been playing. Let's pick on I don't know something. You've been playing. No, we're still gonna pick on Magda. Just a great example. You've been playing Magda for months, and then it wins a tournament, and everyone's talking about it. It may not be super helpful to hear like, hey, now's not the time for Magda. But the reality is that may just be the truth.
Yeah. Unfortunately. I still respect you if you want to take the deck that you are really passionate about, because sometimes I want more people to play those kinds of decks. I think I talked about this in our year in review. Just play what you want, play what you're passionate about, keep the format interesting. Don't just play what everyone is saying is the best deck. That's boring. Boo. But yeah, no, if you're going in it trying to spike it, yeah, be realistic. Maybe Magda isn't the choice right after it won. Cool. And the last thing in our kind of deck power metric perceived threat level discrepancy would be resiliency, where I think people tend to be pretty bad at they're fairly good at assessing what kind of stacks a deck is resilient to, um, and what types of interaction a deck is resilient to. But I think there is opportunity to find an edge where people are bad at assessing how much interaction is required to stop a deck, how resilient it is to amounts of interaction. Um, so, I think, I'll use a personal example. Riel tends to play a very inevitable game where you run so many freaking counter spells and stuff that you can stop people in the early game. But when you start accruing so much card advantage that when you go for your combo turn, you end up having like, 4 or 5 counter spells. And, I've talked to Morgan and Reed before about I think this was on our drive down to Punt City. I was like, I think I can probably, I think I'd probably have a higher win rate with Riel if I went for my win sooner, before I had like 5 pieces of interaction, because I think people aren't accurately assessing like I'm being like super cautious with how much interaction and protection I need when people are not respecting the deck or the win con like to that degree. So that's an area where I can improve, and I think other people might be able to improve as well. Yeah, just see how people are reacting to how much interaction are they keeping up when they're trying to stop you. You know, yeah. Anything to add?
Not on taking advantage of it. I guess now we just have to cover, not falling prey to it. And I think
Yeah.
we've largely, I mean, well, that's not true. I'd like to believe that explaining, understanding how a bias works makes you immune or at least resistant to it. But
There has to be a bias name for that.
unfortunately, that is not true.
Yeah.
Both, contemporary evidence as well as scientific studies bear this out. Um, so, you do need to, rather than just being aware that, for example, your perceptions are influenced by community discourse, you do actually have to take steps to, look at whatever, maybe whatever data is available, or, I mean, sometimes it can just be as simple as like, hey, gold, if you have a sufficient understanding of how the deck works, goldfish a few hands. Is it actually as fast as, people are sort of making it out to be? Like, how often, do you find, you're able, like, this deck is able to set things up? And then as you sort of understand the deck a little better, some of the biases that may have influenced you can subside a little bit.
I think one of the things too is it's just a lot of work and it can be tedious to really combat these biases. I think, for like the clout, authority, discourse, echo chambers, all those kinds of biases, like, you need to do things like, someone puts up an opinion on a deck or a card, like just take the opposite stance and, try and justify like the opposite case. And really, if you can convince yourself that, the opposite case is true, then maybe their argument is weak. Maybe it's not the case that it's completely, the opposite is actually true, but maybe it's just that their argument isn't weak and you should be taking what they say, not, you shouldn't be weighting that very highly. And, remember next time you're like trying to act on those assumptions, like, oh yeah, maybe I shouldn't kind of, think that this is the best deck in the format just because so-and-so said it. But yeah, that's hard, requires active work and kind of conscious thought. Also another one is like habit building. We're talking about talking in game and not necessarily just politicking, but announcing things like, I think so-and-so is the threat. That can be useful. Or one thing that's fun to do is shot calling tutors, right? So you need to be careful with this in tournaments, but I think in games that are casual, it can be very useful to do this just to build the habits and the kind of like mental pathways for this, which is just to shot call tutors, right? Because in a tournament, you might shot call a tutor and you're like, oh, you're right, that is the better tutor target, and they'll go find that. So you got to be careful of that. But, otherwise, you also look like giga-brained when you shot call like some niche tutor niche tutor target because you were able to accurately assess the board, the situation, and you have good knowledge of their deck. So doing things like that, pointing out threats, announcing, throwing it out there, being like, hey, so does everyone know how this deck wins? Like, maybe not getting them to explain it to you, but just making sure everyone's on the same page and then being like, okay, well, for those of you who don't know, he's going to do this and this, and he's going to tutor for Clock of Omens, and then he's going to do this massive chain or whatever. And, if you have this kind of interaction, this is the time to use it, declaring that, because not everyone might be aware. If I think in that instance, that Koibito won, right, in that finals pod, if someone had announced this is the time to interact, or if you have interaction, hold it, don't interact here, that might have actually, changed the outcome of that tournament.
Yeah. I recognize that it's not sort of ideal in that a lot of our advice is just kind of eat your vegetables. But
dude, play around days, play around wasteland.
But yeah, like I think what you pointed out is important to acknowledge. Like, it is work to develop good impressions, accurate impressions, a good understanding of the format, overcoming various biases that you might have accrued. Like, all of this does take work. So don't feel bad if like you are still running into problems from time to time, or you think oh, I still don't know how to do X, Y, Z. There's just a lot of, there's just a lot of it.
I also think this is like, these are fundamental habits too. These are ones that, we've talked in other episodes about, like, how to politic, how to do all, like, threat assess in game for certain things, or like, bluff or do all of these things. Those are more like advanced techniques or strategies or whatever you want to call them, that are dependent on having a good set of fundamentals. And threat assessment is, the most fundamental thing in CDH. Knowing what is the threat, what is most threatening, and how to expend your resources, or, making sure everyone else is on the same page, like, that's so fundamental. And you can build a lot off of this. So if you're going to put work into anything, put it into this first. Yeah.
I think that's
cool.
all we got
Wraps it up for our main topic. I'm excited to hopefully, speaking of like discourse and stuff, I hope this actually sparks some discussion on our Discord server. We've had some great discussions in the general chat, super lengthy post paragraphs, people sharing their opinions. I'd love to hear people's opinions on kind of the structure we laid out for the power metrics, for decks, and then also like ways to combat biases. Maybe we missed some stuff too. I'd love to hear it. But yeah, before we wrap up, we have a listener question. Well, let me. Oh God, need to make the screen a lot bigger.
I'll read it.
You read it. Okay,
this was
perfect.
Asked a little while ago by Mustard, who asked, "How much of an edge does playing an unknown or obscure deck give you? For example, I've had multiple tables like combo pieces resolve in Maria because they do not understand the win lines." This is from a few months ago when Maria was new. But I think
Tremendous.
it ties in very nicely with sort of this discussion, which is it is an advantage right up until it's not. It certainly it certainly can be a big advantage to have people not really understand what you're doing, not know how to stop you. But, that advantage can dry up very quickly if you just run into someone who understands. And the other issue is, there is, and maybe we should have covered this a little bit more in the topic itself, particularly with opacity, there can be sort of a reverse effect where if people truly have no idea what you're doing, sometimes that just means they they just start flailing. And I was like, I don't understand how to stop this deck, so I'll just kill it. And like we saw this a lot with like Karkashima, right, where it was like, well, I'll just never ever let them have 2 Karks in play, and that's not a terrible idea. Because that deck is very threatening. With something like Maria, if someone just goes like, well, I'll just never let you have Maria in play, then they're obviously like way over threat assessing you.
Yeah, that could be a disadvantage to over threat assess something. It's not just a disadvantage to the player who is being over threat assessed, or it's also could be a disadvantage to you because you're like, man, I need them to contribute to stopping my other opponents, and if they're completely dead in the water because they're so commander centric, they can't deploy stacks pieces, they can't dig for interaction, like now you're playing table police against 2 other players when you could have had someone who is like relatively under control but then also contributing to handling everyone else. So yeah, like also not over threat assessing is an important is important as well.
So I would definitely, sort of to summarize, I would say it's an advantage but not a reliable one. You'll run into people who overreact to things they don't understand, and you will run into people who understand and as we were talking about earlier, can explain to the rest of the table. So I would not rely on it.
I think there's a Goldilocks zone, Like I actually think Riel, like people when I take Riel to a table, people are like, how does he, like, they're not like, how does he win? They know it's breach, right? But where the opacity comes in is like how strong is, like, how inevitable is it? How strong are his card advantage engines? Like how much interaction removal? Like they don't know the deck list, right? Like they don't know the deck list itself. They don't know the ratios of cards. So they're not sure there, but they know how I win. So they know the appropriate amount to be scared. Like well, there's this kind of rule of law in place, so I know he's not going to win through that, or whatever. Like there is a Goldilocks zone. If they just know nothing about your deck, people are really scared of the unknown. So yeah. Cool. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. If you guys would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter at IntoNorthPod, via our email, intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description for this episode. Extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses for our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you too would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/IntoNorthPodcast. Another way you can support us is via our TCG Player affiliate link. So anytime you want to purchase something from TCG Player, if you use our affiliate link, which is in the podcast/YouTube description, a portion of your purchase goes towards supporting the podcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre for our lovely podcast music, and to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo. Next episode will be out in 2 weeks. Until then, see ya.
Have a good one.